back, guys. So maybe at this point you're wondering why exactly we examined these debates in science and why exactly we talked about people's different opinions on consciousness. Well, one reason is because you guys are all going to have different definitions of consciousness. That you guys are going to be, every one of you is going to have a different definition. In fact, when I taught a very similar class to this called the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness class at UC Santa Cruz, we had students that formulated their own definitions. A lot of the creative projects ranged from scientific experiments that demonstrated in the student's mind that consciousness is obviously a something that is produced by neural activity. It's produced by the physicality of the brain. Other people produced pieces of art and demonstrated, in a very thorough way and gave persuasive arguments for how this artistic expression relates to consciousness. So we are going to be exploring more subjective material. And this is our introduction to non-traditional psychology. And the differences between what we took selections from mainstream psychology that you and I talked about earlier. And now we're going to be looking at things like humanistic psychology. We're going to be looking at transpersonal psychology. We're going to be even looking at something called eco-psychology. And you might be wondering why we're talking about these things. You've probably never heard of these obscure branches of psychology, but a lot of the time people don't notice them. There are people that put a lot of time into thinking about things in this way, and they're not necessarily noticed by the mainstream. So we're going to spend some time examining them and, again, taking our objective view about what these branches of psychology are doing well, maybe what they're not doing so well, and really formulating, again, our own opinions about them. But I want to give just a very brief introduction to what these different branches of psychology are. So we can talk about humanistic psychology. Now, I know you've studied a little bit of psychology,
a little bit, yeah.
And even in the mainstream, we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Basically the premise is we can't attain self-fulfillment, self-actualization without first reaching these bottom tiers. And of course that starts with basic things like food. We have to pay attention to food before we can pay attention to, for instance, love, which is on the next thing. So his idea is that we can't satisfy these upper desires of love, of connectivity, without first going after the basics.
Right.
And so that leads to a natural progression through steps.
Yeah, people even forget that we need to breathe before we need to eat.
Exactly.
There are many things. I mean, we can't survive for even a few minutes without oxygen, without O2, the terminal electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. Again, everything is relating in this course that we're talking about. So humanistic psychology, is obviously a subject that people are going to have different definitions of all these branches of psychology. But it emphasizes the potential we have as human beings.
For growth, right?
For growth.
Yeah.
And I've always looked at it as, this is true. This is obviously true. We've seen this in how malleable the brain is, of how the brain can change, of how we can get over certain extreme illnesses, how we can achieve greatness, and even self-actualization, as Maslow talks about. Another branch of psychology that I think is very interesting and again ties into what we're talking about is eco-psychology. This one is quite rare.
I can't say I've heard of it. You're going to have to explain that one.
Yeah, so eco-psychology really talks about our connection to nature and what it means for us to be connected to
part of the grander whole.
I think that's correct. I think it's really looking at getting back to nature and how this could help us, and especially, you know, different forms of pathology that we have. I mean, let's take a minute and just imagine what would happen if we got a bunch of our kids who have ADD and ADHD and we expose them to more nature programs. That often our kids are growing up in these very urban environments and they're not exposed to the beauty, and they're not exposed to the how the earth was before we inhabited it, and we haven't paid attention to the overall impact that we as human beings are having on the earth. Not to mention many of the subjects that other professors are going to be teaching you guys about the effects of climate change, okay? About what we're doing, about how we can live more harmoniously with the earth. And I don't want to say any more because you're going to be reading, you're actually going to be watching, a short video by Peter Kahn about what his definition of eco-psychology is. And lastly, one of my favorite branches of psychology that I find myself sometimes not agreeing with always, but I find fascinating, is called Transpersonal Psychology. Again, another obscure branch of psychology that is not necessarily mentioned in the mainstream, but it revolves around what are happening in those really, really precious moments that we remember. Maybe what are happening in the moments that really impact you as a human being. Maybe, you remember, when someone died and it had an extreme impact on you in your life. Maybe you remember maybe one of you remember when your baby brother was born, or when your baby sister was born, or maybe you remember when your parents got divorced. Maybe you remember when something really scary happened. Maybe you remember a time where you almost died, where you had a near-death experience. This is the psychology looking at those aspects that mainstream psychology doesn't necessarily address in proper ways. And that's why these branches were invented, looking at what it means to be spiritual, what that means. And I will say that mainstream psychologists and scientists will accuse many of these branches of psychology of being non-empirical. How can you study something like spirituality?
Yeah.
How can
numbers,
you,
at least.
Exactly, but we have to remember studying spirituality is not necessarily that much different from studying the complexity of human behavior. Like we were talking before, it's more difficult. It becomes more, as we get into these realms of subjectivity, it becomes more difficult and more difficult. But I'll make the connection that, humanistic psychology, the potential to change in our lives, maybe that has to do a lot with neuroscience. We've examined how the brain can change. We've examined how synapses are formed.
Yeah.
We've examined how neurons can literally seek out different areas, how in neurodevelopment we look at axon guidance and these very advanced topics that you guys were exposed to that, of course, I don't expect you guys to remember everything about. But maybe maybe humanistic psychology, maybe transpersonal psychology, maybe even eco-psychology, maybe they're saying a lot of the same things about neuroscience. So what I would like you guys to do, okay, in your form conversation questions, apart from what I have written here about really understanding these subjects from the level that we can do in a week, okay, how are they relating to the rest of the course? Okay, what have you learned about the brain? What have you learned about behavior? What have you seen in the different TED Talks that we've watched? What have you learned about how technology, about how society is progressing? How does this relate to these areas of psychology? And if you could articulate those to your peers, again, similar to the discussion that Jack and I have had right here, that would be awesome. So get together, do that, and have a great week.